Good morning. Today's word of the Lord reading is Luke 15, 1 through 10. Parable of the Lost Sheep. Tax collectors and other notorious sinners often came to listen to Jesus teach. This made the Pharisees and teachers of religious law complain that he was associating with such sinful people, even eating with them. So Jesus told them this story. If a man has 100 sheep and one of them gets lost, what will he do? Won't he leave the 99 others in the wilderness and go to search for the one that is lost until he finds it? And when he has found it, he will joyfully carry it home on his shoulders. When he arrives, he will call together his friends and neighbors, saying, "Rejoice with me, because I have found my lost sheep." In the same way, there is more joy in heaven over one lost sinner who repents and returns to God than over 99 others who are righteous and haven't strayed away. Parable of the lost coin. Or suppose a woman has 10 silver coins and loses one. Won't she light a lamp and sweep the entire house and search carefully until she finds it? And when she finds it, she will call in her friends and neighbors and say, "Rejoice with me, because I have found my lost coin." In the same way, there is joy in the presence of God's angels when even one sinner repents.
Thank you, Gigi. Those two parables happen to be the two parables right before the parable of the prodigal son, and that's where we began last week in what is going to be a shorter series on looking at the parable of the prodigal son. In this year, where we're going to be looking at the life of Jesus and the works of Jesus and the ways of Jesus, we also are going to be looking at the teachings of Jesus and just how powerful they are. And so we started last week in this series where the overall title of the series is called "They're All Prodigals." And we started last week by laying a little bit of a foundation and then going directly into looking at one of the key characters, the older brother, inside of that story. And today we're going to continue in that series, and we're going to continue by looking at the life of the younger brother or the younger son. And so I've entitled today's message, Pigpen Grace. Pigpen Grace. And so again, last week we started by looking at the definition of prodigal, because we need to understand what we're talking about when we talk about prodigal, so that we can understand how each of the characters in the story indeed is a prodigal. And so last week we looked and we saw this. The definition we're using of prodigal is spending money or resources freely and recklessly. Wastefully extravagant, having or giving something on a lavish scale. So reckless, full. That's the definition we're using of prodigal. And so last week we saw that the older brother was a prodigal in his own ways. He was full of stubbornness and anger at both dad and younger brother. He was full of ignorance and not understanding his relationship with his father. And he was full of self-righteousness. And so with this definition in mind, we soon realized that there wasn't just one prodigal in this story, but that all three main characters, are prodigals in their own right. They're all extravagant with certain things. They're all reckless. And we said last week, reckless doesn't necessarily mean bad, as in the reckless love of God. It's just immense or intense. And we see that all three characters then had that. And so today we're going to look chronologically, if you will. We're going to look in the order of the parable. And we're going to see, actually, last week we looked at 4. Today we're going to briefly look at a couple more. We're going to look at a total of 6 ways, quickly, 6 ways that we see that the prodigal son was indeed a prodigal. And then next week, and probably the week after, I think it's going to take 2 sermons, we're going to look at the father, because he is the most important figure in the story. And there is so much good that we learn from looking at him. But let's start today by looking at the younger son. Luke 15, and the story starts at verse 11, but we're going to just look right at verse 12 to start. Luke 15, verse 12, the NIV says this: "The younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." So he divided his property, the father did, between them. So right from the bat, we're going to see two areas in which the prodigal son was reckless. The first was this: he was a prideful prodigal, reckless with his hubris in his narcissism. Hubris is just like pride exponential. It's like a bigger word for pride. And narcissism seems to be all around us. That's a buzzword nowadays, where people are very much focused inward and on themselves to the neglect of those outside of them. And we see in the prodigal son story right from the beginning that nothing else mattered to the younger son. Nothing. In fact, by telling his father that he wanted the share of the estate, in reality, what he was telling his father was, "I wish you were dead." Right? I wish you were dead. Hey, the fact that you're alive is keeping me from my half of the inheritance. It's keeping me from my half of what's coming to me. I wish you were dead. It'd be better off if you were dead. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and just act like you were dead. So I'd like half my stuff now, and then I'm going to take off, believing to sever that relationship. So nothing else mattered to the younger son. In Judges chapter 21, we read this in verse 25. Judges 21, verse 25, and I'm reading out of the Holman Christian Standard Bible because I like the translation. It's talking about the kingdom or the tribe of Israel once they're in the promised land. And the word is, in those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did whatever they wanted. I feel like today you could say, and in those days, there was not a lot of this in America. And everybody just did what they wanted. Yeah? And let's be honest, it's not just America, but it seems like we could say that around the world today. That there is this idea of hubris and narcissism. And again, not to necessarily pick on social media. I feel like I do that a lot, but because it's been an amazing tool and it's beautiful when it's used correctly. But nowadays, it allows us to be narcissistic, right? We could take hey, check this out. I was eating Subway for lunch, and now I get 1 million likes of people because I ate a sandwich. You know? And we're all of a sudden, we're wondering why we have this narcissism inside of us. It is partly because we can be famous in our own right instantaneously. And we have this idea of narcissism. And what comes along with narcissism is often an attitude that we don't worry about the future. We only live for today. And in that sense, it's very, very reckless. Right? James 4:6 says this, and he gives grace generously. As the scriptures say, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. And so the younger son telling his father basically, hey man, kind of wish you hadn't lived so long. I'd like my piece of this. And then I'm going to go spend it however I want, recklessly. It's all about me, and it's all about what I want. He sees his father then as nothing more than a paycheck. He sees the relationship with his father as nothing more than his bank, his ATM machine. He sees his father only being good for what he can use him for. You know anybody that way? Unfortunately, maybe in your life or somewhere else, you've met those people who it somehow seems like they're kind of willing to step on whoever they need to get where they need to be. Or maybe, unfortunately, there's people we know in our lives who have, unfortunately, maybe even used us at times just because of what we can do for them. A blank check, if you will. An ATM card. And we see that right from the beginning of this story. This younger son has got this mindset that everything needs to be about me. I mean, think of it from the father's point of view, and we'll look at this in the weeks ahead, but think of that. Basically, hearing your son say, dude, just give me my stuff. I just want to get out of here. I want to get away from you. I wish you were dead. I mean, you got it. We would say that's evil thinking, and yet what that thinking is it's very indicative of this type of hubris, in this type of narcissism, where it doesn't matter who I hurt as long as I benefit. We feel that we're probably surrounded by that in the world today. So right from the beginning, from the story, we see that the prodigal son was a prideful prodigal, reckless with his hubris and narcissism. Second, we see this. He was a 21st century prodigal, reckless with his impatience and entitlement. That seems, in everything I read about our generations that are now, I'm a Gen X, and then you had Gen Y and Gen Z, and then millennials, and then I don't even know what we're at now. Maybe, help me, but still millennials, whatever it is. What we hear about these younger generations, right or wrong, is that they feel entitled. That they feel entitled. That's a very 21st century mindset. And I remember even myself having to fight that. And usually it looked innocent enough, but what we see is that we have these young people in our lives, and talking, when I was younger, and we see like maybe what our parents had or what our grandparents had that took them 30, 40, and 50 years to work for, but we want it today. Right? That's entitled. So it's not like, it can creep up on us because it doesn't seem that awful, but what it is that we're just impatient. And what we see here in the prodigal son is that he was just impatient. What he received from his father, he was going to ultimately receive. It just wasn't going to be fast enough for him. Right? It was going to just not be fast enough. He didn't want to wait for his dad to die because he wanted it to come to him now. So instead of cutting his proverbial brake lines, right, and get rid of his dad and maybe committing homicide, he just goes to his pops and says, hey, I'm just going to act like that's happened anyways. Instead of waiting for what's coming to me, it needs to be mine today. And we grow impatient. This reminded me of a story we went over, I think it's been about 3 years ago now when we were doing a series. We looked at a story found in Genesis chapters 16 through 18. And in Genesis chapter 16 and 18 through 18, if you go back through the story, it is the story of Abraham sleeping or having an affair with his wife's slave Haggai and giving birth to Ishmael. Yeah? And if you look back, in fact, the name of that sermon, it was a sermon series, but a particular sermon I preached was, we have to be careful not to birth Ishmaels. Right? And what we mean by that is so many of us will birth an Ishmael because we see something we want, and we want it now, and so we're impatient and we do what it takes. And in fact, what we even see in Abraham is it doesn't always have to be bad things. Abraham himself, if you understand the context of it, what Abraham and Sarah were trying to do is they were just trying to prime the pump of God. They were trying to help God out. Hey, God, you promised us a child. I'm old. Sarah's old. So we're going to help you out. It's so many times when God gives us a vision or we have a desire to do something from God, it's only really God's will when it happens in God's timing. And what we got to be careful of is that we don't take what He wants from us, we don't take what we want from Him, and we don't want to do it in our own time. We can't birth those Ishmaels. Are we tracking? So what happens in that story is Abraham gives birth to an Ishmael. Ishmael and Isaac fight, and to this day, they're still fighting. It is understood through genealogy and lineage that Ishmael is the father of modern-day Islam. You can track Islam all the way back to Ishmael, where you can track Judeo-Christian beliefs all the way back to Isaac. And so this beautiful promise from God happens. Abraham's told he's going to have a child. Abraham primes the pump, helps him out a little bit, is impatient and feels entitled to have that son now. And here we are some 3, 4, 5,000 years later. And by the way, those two people are kind of still fighting. It didn't seem maybe like a big deal back then, and here we are today. And what we see in this beginning part of the prodigal son story is he feels entitled to what's coming to him, but it shouldn't be coming to him now. So again, it's not even that it was bad what was coming to him. In fact, it was good. He was going to get an inheritance after his father's died. Sometimes it's good. It doesn't have to be bad. But if we take it and we grab it out of God's hands too soon, it can cause our destruction. And we see that the prodigal son was full of impatience and entitlement. So those are the first two. And then moving on, we want to continue the story. I want to look at verse 17. So picking up Luke 15, verse 17, we read these words. So he's gone off. He sowed his oats. He wasted all his money, and now a famine happens in the land, and he has to sell himself to a farmer to help feed the pigs. We pick it up in verse 17. When he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare? And here I am starving to death. I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants, or make me like one of your slaves.'" This is when the story of the prodigal son starts to turn. Right? We have this entitlement and this impatience. Right? We have this hubris and this narcissism. But now we see someone hitting rock bottom and things start to change. And what we see is that the prodigal son was a contrite prodigal, full of sorrow. He was contrite and full of sorrow. There's that famous verse, Psalms 51:17, and I'm reading it out of the New King James Version. "The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. These, O God, you will not despise." We see a change. We see a change in the heart and in the thought process of the prodigal son. And now we see a contrite heart. And we see remorse starting to set in. And one of the keys here is in that very first, actually I'm going to go back so you can see it, is in that very first line. Chapter 17. The first 6 words are powerful. When he came to his senses. When he came to his senses. Because we know the truth, and that is that living a sinful lifestyle will distort our thinking. Living a sinful lifestyle will distort our thinking. Sin is fun for a season. The Bible even tells us that. If it wasn't, we wouldn't be tempted. If sin always seemed painful or the wrong thing at the beginning, it wouldn't be much of a temptation. But our mind gets distorted. And we have to come to our senses. Romans 12:2. Don't copy the behavior and customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think. Right? I'm reading out of the New Living. You probably recognize the New International Version. By the transforming of your mind. We have to be renewed by the transforming of our mind. Then you will learn to know God's will for you, which is good and pleasing and perfect. And in fact, the culmination of today's message is going to go back to this idea of remorse. Because what we're starting to see is we're starting to see a heart change. We're starting to see a heart change. And the prodigal son is now a contrite prodigal, full of remorse. And that leads to the next one. Not only was he contrite, but then we see that he was a humbled prodigal. Again, full of humility. Right? He is now humbled by his experience. Now, we got to remember how the story starts. The story starts that he's a young kid who's entitled, probably got some rich parents. You know, you ever go to school with some of those kids? I remember going to school with those. I went to a college that I could only afford to go to because I was on an athletic scholarship. So I hung out with all the poor kids. But our college, you know, it's like, oh, there's a lot of mommy and daddy money around here. Yeah? And again, nothing wrong with that whatsoever. I just didn't have it. You know, I was envious. So there's zero things wrong with it. It's just a fact. And some then did have that kind of entitled idea. And so we see that in the story of this prodigal son, right from the beginning. My pops is rich. I want half of it to be mine, and I'm going to go out and I'm going to waste it all. The world's about me, me, me. My narcissism's here. I take everything I want, and I get out of here. Then he blows through it all, and all of a sudden we see that he is now humbled by his experience. To the point where he finds himself feeling even unworthy to be called his son. I mean, that's an intense level of humility. You went from, give me everything, I wish you were dead, in a very short amount of time to, I don't even think I'm worthy to be a son anymore. I was an heir. Everything I wanted was mine. And now I don't even feel worthy to be his son. Unfortunately, we all know this probably personally, and we definitely know it's happened to people, how much our circumstances and experiences can humble us. Pretty quickly. Yeah? Oh, I've been humbled, right? 1 Peter 5, verse 6 in the NIV reads, "Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time." See, let God lift you up. Don't do it yourself. Stay humble. But here's the key, and this is one of the things that we're starting to see when he thinks he's unworthy to be called his son. Humility is good. Shame is bad. See, we need to understand that. It is very good to be humble, but shame is a tool of Satan. Humility says, I know who I am, and sometimes I mess up. Shame is, because I mess up, I am a mess up. I internalize it. I fail, so therefore I am a failure. See, that's shame. And God doesn't teach us shame. He teaches us humility. A great definition of humility is not thinking lowly or thinking less of yourself. It's just thinking of yourself less. Right? It's just you're not the focus of all your thoughts all the time. It's the opposite then of that hubris and narcissism. It's not thinking lowly of yourself. It's not berating yourself. You're a created being of the Most High God, made in His image. It's not kicking yourself and, oh, how unworthy am I. It's just realizing that the Son is the center of the universe and not you. But often we know that a lot of times it takes experiences to get there. And so though we strive to be humble, and the Bible tells us to be humble, right here Peter tells us, be humble and let God pick us up. We want to be careful that we don't cross that line from humility to shame. Are we tracking? So then we see this heart turn in the middle, where now we see a prodigal that's full of remorse and is full of humility. And then he comes home, right? And before he even comes home, well, he's in the pig pen. He is practicing what he's going to say, right? He's practicing. I'm going to go home. My father's hired hands have enough to eat. I'm going to go to my father and say, Father, I have sinned against heaven and you. I'm no longer worthy to become your son. Just make me one of your hired servants, right? You could just see him in the pig pen feeding the pigs, just repeating this time and time again so he gets his elevator speech, right? He knows what he's going to say as soon as he gets there. He keeps going over and over again. And then he makes the trek home. And we see the father run in this beautiful story. And again, that's where we're going to spend the next 2 weeks. But we see the son here when his father runs to him and meets him. And the son says in verse 21, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Humility has switched over to shame. And this is where, in this amazing turn of the story, we see that this younger brother has some of the same feelings we saw last week of the older brother. And here it is, identical to last week. He was an ignorant prodigal, reckless with his misunderstanding. That's the exact words I used last week for the older brother. Right? The older brother is sitting there slaving away. It even says, Father, I've been acting like a slave for you, and you never even given me the fatted calf. And the older brother thought that what he did or didn't do affected his relationship. And here we see that even though it's on the other side of the story, The younger son is battling the exact same thing. That is so key. This could be a sermon series in and of itself, because our identity can be distorted by thinking too highly of ourselves, and it's all about what we've done like the older brother, or it can be thwarted in our identity, can be misunderstood by thinking too lowly of ourselves. You don't understand, Pastor, what I've done. God couldn't possibly love me. And yet, two extremes, and they have this one thing in common, this amazing thing in common. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. And just like his brother, they both didn't understand their relationship. I used this picture last week, so I wanted to use it again. See, like the older brother thought he was a slave, like that picture on the left. But the younger son in the same way he's a slave to the pigs, right? And then he comes home and he's willing just to be a slave or a hired servant for his father because he thinks what he's done is unforgivable. He thinks there is no going back. And he views himself on the left. But the father views himself like the father on the right. See, both sons don't. Both sons see the left picture, but the father sees the picture on the right. It doesn't matter what you have or haven't done. You're my son because you're my son. You're God's daughter because you're his daughter. You haven't messed up too much. Or you're not so good that you've earned it. See, if you can earn it, then you can unearn it. And it becomes a works-based mentality. They both thought their relationship with the Father was secured in what they did or did not do. And the Father was trying to get them to see that it was just about who they are. It's just about who they were. Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9. And I'm reading this time out of the English Standard Version. It says this: "For by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not your own doing. It is the gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast." No one can boast. There's no room for that hubris and narcissism we saw at the beginning of the story. And in fact, a lot of that hubris and narcissism is out by now. And what we see is, instead of being full of those things, we see a prodigal that is full again of misunderstanding. There's nothing you've ever done, and there's nothing you can ever do to lose your sonship or daughtership with your Heavenly Father. Nothing. Nothing. But so many of us walk around and we feel like, well, this week I'm definitely a son because, I read my Bible 5 times. I prayed like twice. And I didn't even honk at that person driving slow in the left lane. And so I'm definitely a son today. But then next week, not so much. And so it's this idea. And what happens is, when our identity is based on our works, it's such an uneven ground. It's building our house on the sand, but building ourselves on the rock is saying, God, I mess up all the times, and sometimes I get it right, and sometimes I don't. But that in no way has a bearing on my relationship. I am always and forever your son. I'm always and forever your daughter. Not because of what I've done, but because of what you've done on the cross for me. Amen? That is so important to remember. I said last week, we got to focus. I think this is one of the biggest tools of Satan, especially in the church today. If Satan can't make you sin, he will make you busy. Because you feel like, okay, I just got to keep doing for the Lord. I'm doing. We become those human doings instead of those human beings for God. And we misunderstand our relationship. So we see it can happen on both sides. If you feel more like the older brother some days and more like the prodigal son some days, good, you're in good company. Ask me what day it is and I can tell you how I feel. I'm usually one or the other. I want to be more like the father, but we usually default one way or another. And the thing we have to understand is, though God is trying to perfect us always and sanctify us always, it does not affect our relationship. Your adoption papers were not signed in pencil. Right? We're talking permanent ink here. forever and always beloved by your Father. And so we see that there's a misunderstanding. So even though he comes home, there's a misunderstanding. But here's the climax and the sixth and final point. He was a scared prodigal, absolutely full of fear. We're going to see in the next few weeks why that was so foolish, because there's no reason to fear the Father. But we see here fear. We see fear beginning when he's in the pig pen. And he's reciting what he's going to say to his dad just so he can make sure he gets it right. In his mind, he's thinking, I've got to get this speech right. I got to be contrite enough. Do I get, you can almost see him practicing. All right, do I get out on a knee to talk to him? Or no, maybe he thinks that's a marriage proposal. Do I get on both knees? Do I try to cry? On the way home, am I sniffing onions to get tears in my eyes? Like, what can I do to make myself look contrite? I only got one shot. All right, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I know that. You can just see the whole way home just reciting. But it's because of fear. He is hopeful. He is hopeful that the Father will take him back, but only as a servant. So he's hopeful he could be a servant because he's afraid he'll never be a son. He's hopeful he can be a servant because he's afraid he can never be a son. Satan still uses that today on each and every one of us. Many of us will walk through life hopeful that God can find us worthy to use, afraid that we can never be a son or daughter. But 1 John 4:18, we read these words, there is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. And the one who fears is not made perfect in love. He is so afraid. And that fear is because he still doesn't understand his relationship. Fear is often based out of ignorance, right? You've heard that saying, we fear what we don't understand. He doesn't understand his relationship still. He knows that his father's a good enough man that even if he's just a servant, he won't starve to death. But he doesn't understand the love of the Father. And so that ignorance breeds fear. And he's hopeful he can be a servant, afraid he can never be a son. The difference is this. He shouldn't be afraid of not being able to be a son again, because he was never not a son in the first place. Okay, you don't lose your sonship. You don't lose your daughtership. There's nothing to be afraid of. So many of us are afraid, God, just make me one of your hired servants. I'm unworthy of anything else. God's like, what are you talking about? You've always and forever been my son or my daughter. And you always will be. But here's the hard part. And here's, in this last slide, again, this is the climax. It's also the close. Again, we're going to see in the weeks ahead why the fear was just so unnecessary, because we're going to see over probably, again, 2 weeks, just how good and loving the Father is. But love requires free will. And love requires choice. And sometimes we don't always make the right choice. And yet we're promised that in God, He can work all things for our benefit. And so here's where I want us to leave today with this thought. And this is just where I want to close. It was grace. This is hard to understand maybe. So I'm going to let you wrestle with this all week. It was grace that brought the prodigal son to his knees and to his senses. Maybe it doesn't always feel like grace when we hit rock bottom. Very few of us would call that rock bottom G-R-A-C-E, right? We wouldn't probably name it grace. But grace can look like a pig pen sometimes. Because sometimes that's what it takes to get us back into our senses. And sometimes it's the pig pen's what it takes to get us back into the loving embrace of our Father. Not because He won't embrace us, because we were far away. There's only one person that ever runs in this story. And it's the Father back to the Son. So maybe you're here today and you find yourself in a pig pen, or you can look back on pig pens of your life. I can. I put myself in some pig pens, yeah. So maybe that's you today, and maybe you're here and you're like, yeah, Pastor, that's me. And it doesn't always feel like grace. I've often asked God, why do you let us hit rock bottom? And it's like sometimes it's rock bottom's the only option I have to where I can come to my senses, right? I'm stubborn. I don't know about you, but I can be stubborn. So God, I'd be like, God, why didn't you stop this from happening? It's like, well, you're so stubborn, you wouldn't come to your senses. Sometimes it takes a literal knock on the head, right? And that's what that rock, that hard place can be, that rock bottom, and that pig pen. It's not, and we're going to see this in a couple weeks, but I'm going to give you a preview now because I don't want you to freak out this week. The pig pen is not God's punishment. The Father didn't send him to the pig pen. No? See, we got to be real careful here, and that's where we're going to focus heavy in the weeks ahead, the next 2 weeks ahead. The Father didn't call up somebody and be like, hey, I need you to put my son to work feeding the hogs. And see what happens when we get pig pens, we're like, oh, God is punishing us. Oh. The prodigal ended up by the pig pen by his own choices. But as soon as he came to his senses, it says, God, sometimes grace can look like a pig pen, and I never like that. And yet, I think if we sit with that for just a few moments, we can see that it's love. In this way, you can see that sometimes it's what it takes to bring us back to the heart of the Father. And what you're waiting for is not even for us to come and to lament and be a servant. You're looking a far way off, waiting for us to walk back to you. You're not waiting for us to run to you. You're waiting for us just to come to our senses, leave our pig pen. You run. God, we've seen the story, the prodigal son doesn't run. The prodigal son's probably taking his time, afraid to even confront his father. You find us a long way off. The pig pen isn't your punishment. In fact, it can be your grace if we allow it to bring us back to the senses. And our senses should tell us we serve a loving Father in whom there is nothing to fear. God, none of us like the pig pens in life. But it's often when we look back where it took that for me to come to my senses and realize you were there the whole time. Help us remember that going forward in Christ's name. Amen. A lot going on with this younger son. We want to close this time with a time of prayer. Again, as I look around, I don't see a lot of visitors today. You guys kind of know how this works, but it's always worth just kind of going over that. We have those questions on the back, right? We're just praying. I know with all my heart that there was something said today that God is working on you with. I just know it because God says his word won't return void, not because I'm good, not because you're good, because our Father's good. And he says when the word goes out, it doesn't return void. So there's something working in your heart. There's something in your mind that I said that's just stirring. Or really, I should say that God said, and through a humble mouthpiece, it was God. So what is God saying to you? Think about that in this time. And then what are you going to do about it? And sometimes it's just getting out of the pig pen. Maybe some of us today just need to get out of that pig pen we're in for some reason and find the grace of a God waiting for us. Maybe you're here and you need prayer for something completely different. What an opportunity to come and ask for prayer. Pray where you're at. The altars are open. Pray with me. Maybe you're here and for whatever reason you just don't even understand that relationship with that kind of Father. And maybe today's the day God just wants to wrap his loving arms around you. It says, dude, I got a robe and a ring and a fatted calf just waiting for us. But no shame. As we stand and we're just reverent and silent before God as he continues to work, join with us as our team sings our final song.